The moment he opened the email, the world seemed to tilt beneath him. Sitting in a cramped, dimly lit barracks halfway across the globe, the words on the screen were almost surreal, as if they had been typed by a stranger rather than the woman he had once loved. It trusted more than anything. "I'm divorcing you." It read simple and cold, devoid of explanation, devoid of apology, devoid of the human warmth that had once defined their relationship. The timing could not have been more brutal. He was deployed thousands of miles away from home, carrying not only the weight of his own responsibilities but also the unspoken burden of protecting his unit and facing dangers that most people could only imagine in movies. In that environment, every sense was heightened. Every noise could signal threat. Every shadow could conceal danger. To have such a devastating personal blow strike in the midst of this chaos was disorienting, to say the least. He felt a strange combination of disbelief and betrayal. His mind raced back to the countless late-night conversations, the promises exchanged under soft lamplight, the plans for the future that now seemed like cruel jokes. Every memory, once a source of comfort, now twisted into a reminder of what he had lost, or perhaps what he had never truly possessed. The email was more than just a notice of divorce. It was a symbolic severing of the life he had imagined, a rejection that arrived not face to face, but through the cold, impersonal medium of technology. In that instant, it felt as though the distance between them was not only physical but emotional, insurmountable, a chasm filled with betrayal that could never be bridged. The environment around him offered no solace. Surrounded by the constant hum of military activity, the briefings, the drills, and the looming threat of combat, he could not simply retreat into grief in private. There were responsibilities that demanded his attention, comrades who relied on him, and the unspoken understanding that weakness could cost lives. Yet, beneath the discipline and professionalism, an emotional storm raged, one that could not be silenced by orders or duty. He wrestled with anger, confusion, and a deep, gnawing sadness, emotions intensified by the isolation that deployment enforced. There was no one he could confide in fully, no familiar presence to ground him, only the sterile walls of the barracks and the distant, almost intangible memory of a life that had been abruptly taken from him. In that moment, the shock of betrayal was absolute. It was not merely the act of being abandoned that stung, but the manner in which it had been executed, the casual click of send. The disregard for his service, his sacrifice, and the life they had shared. Every detail, every memory, every ounce of trust now carried the weight of betrayal. And yet, somewhere beneath the initial devastation, a spark of resolve began to form. This shock, this moment of utter disorientation, would eventually become the catalyst for action, a turning point where grief would transform into determination. But in that instant, all he could do was stare at the screen, heart pounding, mind racing, trying to reconcile the reality of the email with the love he thought he had known. It was a blow that struck deeper than distance, more piercing than danger, a betrayal that would define the next chapter of his life. Beneath the cold simplicity of the email lay a web of intentions and motives that he had not anticipated, a hidden story that revealed far more about her character than the act of divorce itself. Decision always had not been WHI, worn S out of P of a ER, ING, AFLEET, ING, MOMENT of a RENNGE, the or DSMGE, the SPONTANEOU cause whim. It had been calculated, premeditated, and executed with precision. Each word in the email seemed carefully chosen to minimize accountability, to distance herself from the emotional fallout, and to mask the underlying reasons for her departure. The brevity of the message was itself a message, a declaration of independence cloaked in impersonal efficiency, designed to hurt without revealing her true motives. He realized that what had initially seemed like impulsive betrayal was actually the result of deliberate planning. A premeditated act meant to sever ties on her terms, leaving him isolated and blindsided in the process. The deeper truth behind her actions began to emerge as he reflected on patterns he had overlooked. Subtle signs of emotional detachment, secretive behavior, and inconsistencies in her stories now took on new significance. There were the late-night phone calls that were hurriedly ended, the small but persistent excuses to avoid his presence before deployment, and the unexplained absences that had never been questioned. At the time, each of these moments, previously dismissed as trivial or circumstantial, suddenly formed a pattern, a map of her gradual withdrawal and the eventual planning of her exit. Her divorce email was not a spontaneous rupture, but the culmination of months, perhaps years, of manipulation, concealment, and careful orchestration. This revelation intensified his sense of betrayal. It was not only that she had abandoned him, but that she had done so while orchestrating an elaborate deception that had remained invisible until the most critical moment. As he analyzed the situation further, he considered the possible motivations behind her actions. Perhaps it was greed, a desire for material gain or freedom from financial responsibility. Perhaps it was emotional, a pursuit of passion or comfort elsewhere. Or perhaps it was pride, a need to assert control over a situation that had once involved him intimately. Regardless of the motive, the premeditation implied a deliberate choice to inflict maximum emotional damage, while protecting herself from any immediate consequences. The cold efficiency of the email underscored her awareness that he was deployed, vulnerable, and removed from the mechanisms of his own life back home, a fact she exploited without hesitation. The realization of this hidden truth transformed his perspective. He understood that his hurt was intertwined with the recognition that she had calculated every step, every timing, every word to serve her purposes. There was no impulsive malice here. There was strategy, cunning, and a disregard for the emotional devastation she caused. This knowledge, though painful, also became a source of clarity. By understanding the depth and intent behind her actions, he could begin to craft a response not born of raw emotion, but of measured resolve. The hidden truth behind her sudden decision was no longer just a source of pain. It was the blueprint for the next phase of his life, one in which he could reclaim control and ensure that her manipulations would not define his future. The transformation did not happen overnight, but it began as a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in his mindset. At first, the anger and betrayal threatened to consume him, a storm of emotion that could have easily led to impulsive decisions or reckless behavior. Yet the military had instilled in him a discipline that extended beyond physical training and tactical skills. It was a mindset of patience, strategy, and controlled execution. He realized that this same discipline could be applied to the personal battlefield he now faced. His pain became a catalyst, not for destruction, but for careful planning. Every thought, every emotion was filtered through the lens of strategy. He began to consider his next steps not as acts of revenge, but as calculated moves designed to restore balance, to reclaim what had been taken from him, and to ensure that she would face the consequences of her betrayal in a structured and unavoidable manner. He started by assessing the full scope of the situation. While the email had blindsided him emotionally, it had also provided clues about her mindset, priorities, and vulnerabilities. He analyzed her likely motivations, material gain, pride, or perhaps a desire for control, and considered how each could be leveraged to his advantage. Instead of reacting impulsively, he began to create a plan that was comprehensive, methodical, and, above all, disciplined. This was not about emotional gratification. It was about turning a moment of personal devastation into a foundation for empowerment. His approach mirrored the tactical planning he used in the field: gather intelligence, understand the terrain, anticipate moves, and execute with precision. The emotional intensity of the betrayal became fuel rather than a hindrance. He learned to channel his anger into clarity, stripping away the haze of hurt to focus on actionable steps. Where others might have sought immediate confrontation or vengeance, he cultivated patience. He recognized that timing, secrecy, and careful execution were paramount. Every interaction, every decision, and every move was carefully considered. He documented her actions, sought legal avenues, and prepared the groundwork for reclaiming control over his life. His military training had taught him resilience under fire. Now that resilience was applied to a different kind of conflict, one of intellect, strategy, and psychological advantage. Through this process, he also underwent an internal transformation. The man who had once felt blindsided and powerless evolved into someone composed, disciplined, and fiercely self-reliant. The pain of betrayal remained, but it no longer dictated his actions. Instead, it sharpened his focus and honed his resolve. He realized that true power lay not in reacting with raw emotion, but in leveraging knowledge, patience, and strategy to achieve his goals. This internal growth was as significant as any external victory. It was the foundation upon which the next phase of his life, and the consequences for her, would be built. By embracing this transformation, he redefined the narrative of his life. The email that had once represented devastation became the starting point for his empowerment. He had shifted from a state of vulnerability to a position of strategic advantage, from hurt to controlled resolve. This evolution was not just about revenge. It was about reclaiming agency, asserting self-worth, and demonstrating that discipline and intelligence could triumph over betrayal. In the crucible of his emotions, he had forged a new version of himself, one ready to confront the challenges ahead with precision, patience, and unwavering determination. Once he had recalibrated his mindset, he turned his attention to the tangible ways he could ensure that her actions would have real consequences. Unlike a reaction born of raw emotion, his approach was meticulous, strategic, and deliberately measured. He understood that revenge without precision could easily backfire, but calculated measures could shift the power balance in his favor. Every move he made was designed to maximize the impact of her betrayal while minimizing any potential risk to himself. He began by examining the legal, financial, and social avenues available to him. He realized that the law could serve as an impartial instrument, capable of enforcing fairness and protecting his interests, provided he approached it with careful planning and thorough preparation. Financially, he assessed the assets, property, and investments that had been shared or influenced by their marriage. He meticulously documented transactions, maintained records of contributions, and identified areas where her claims could be challenged. This was not about petty vengeance, but about ensuring that she could not manipulate the system to her advantage. Every detail was cross-checked and verified, creating a solid foundation for legal actions that would hold up under scrutiny. By approaching the financial aspect with the precision of a military operation, he transformed what could have been a chaotic, emotionally charged confrontation into a controlled, decisive maneuver. Beyond finances, he focused on social influence and reputation. He recognized that part of her power derived from her ability to manipulate perceptions, to control narratives, and to project an image of victimhood or innocence. He countered this with subtle, strategic revelations, carefully timed and presented to those whose opinions mattered: friends, family, and colleagues. By doing so, he reshaped the social landscape in which she had sought to dominate. Her network of influence, once a tool of advantage, became a terrain in which he had the upper hand. Each revelation was calculated not to humiliate unnecessarily, but to ensure accountability, to make sure that her actions would have visible, undeniable consequences. Emotionally and psychologically, he maintained a calm, composed exterior, demonstrating that her betrayal had not broken him. By rising above impulsive anger, he asserted dominance in a way she could not anticipate. Every meeting, every interaction, and every correspondence was guided by discipline and foresight, emphasizing that the consequences she faced were not random acts of vengeance, but the predictable outcome of her own decisions. This approach also served as a personal shield, preventing him from being drawn into cycles of petty retaliation that could undermine his larger objectives. Through these combined strategies, he ensured that her life was irrevocably altered by her choices. The email that had once caused shock and despair became a tool for empowerment and retribution. By leveraging legal, financial, and social mechanisms with precision, he transformed a personal betrayal into a structured plan of accountability. She could no longer escape the repercussions of her actions, and he emerged not only victorious but strengthened, having turned a moment of profound vulnerability into a testament to resilience, intelligence, and strategic mastery. The consequences she never anticipated were the result of careful preparation, disciplined execution, and the unyielding determination of someone who refused to be a passive victim of betrayal. By the time the dust had settled, the story had shifted from one of raw betrayal to one of undeniable justice and personal triumph. The journey had not been easy. Every step required patience, discipline, and the application of lessons learned both on the battlefield and in life. What had begun as a moment of profound shock, delivered through the cold medium of an email, had transformed into an intricate process of restoration and accountability. He had ensured that every action she took, every attempt to evade responsibility, and every claim she made was met with a precise and strategic countermeasure. This was not a story of petty revenge. It was a narrative of empowerment, resilience, and the restoration of equilibrium. The sense of closure he achieved was deeply rooted in deliberate planning. By leveraging legal frameworks, financial clarity, and social awareness, he created a reality in which she could no longer manipulate or deceive. The consequences were visible and inescapable, not because he had sought to punish out of anger, but because her actions had naturally led to this outcome. She had set the stage, and his careful execution had illuminated the results. Through this process, he reclaimed his sense of self, demonstrating that emotional intelligence and calculated action could outweigh impulsive responses. Every victory, whether it was regaining financial stability, correcting misrepresentations, or establishing a reputation of integrity, enforced the principle that justice need not be violent or vindictive to be effective. Equally important was the internal growth that occurred. He had transformed from a man blindsided by betrayal into someone who could face adversity with composure and strategic clarity. The emotional turmoil of that first email had catalyzed a personal evolution, fostering patience, resilience, and the ability to act with purpose, even under extreme stress. This internal transformation was perhaps the most significant outcome. While the external consequences ensured accountability, it was his mental and emotional mastery that truly defined the ending of the story. He had learned to channel pain into focus, anger into strategy, and heartbreak into empowerment, a combination that fortified him for all future challenges. The narrative also underscored the distinction between justice and cruelty. His actions were measured, deliberate, and aimed at revealing truth rather than inflicting needless suffering. By acting with integrity and intelligence, he ensured that the outcomes reflected accountability rather than arbitrary punishment. She faced the results of her own choices, and in doing so, the story reinforced the principle that betrayal carries natural consequences. But those consequences are magnified when met with awareness, preparation, and resolve. The arc of the story illustrated that true power lies not in vengeance born of emotion, but in deliberate, calculated actions that restore balance and protect one's dignity. Ultimately, the ending was as much about victory as it was about self-realization. He emerged from the ordeal not merely as someone who had corrected the wrongs done to him, but as a person fundamentally changed, stronger, wiser, and capable of facing life on his own terms. The betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable became the foundation for personal empowerment, a lesson in resilience, strategy, and justice. Her life, irrevocably altered by her own choices, mirrored the principle that actions have consequences. Meanwhile, he had reclaimed his narrative, restored his agency, and demonstrated that even in the face of profound betrayal, strength, intelligence, and patience can produce a resolution that is both just and deeply satisfying.